a brand new true crime podcast from the BBC World Service and CBC Podcasts. It's a story about love, deceit, and survival, and it's available now. Find out more at the end of this podcast.
Welcome to The Inquiry with me, Tanya Beckett. One question, 4 expert witnesses, and an answer. It was the fulfillment of what Ukraine's president had been calling for since almost the start of Russia's invasion. Ukrainian forces had pushed back Russia's military from the capital Kiev in March of last year. Then their missile attacks were able to reach behind the front line in the east of the country and destroy key targets. But in order to regain territory they'd lost since the start of the war, Ukraine's army wanted vehicles that could keep their soldiers safe as they forced their way through enemy lines. After all, they were fast running out of their own armoured vehicles and any that could be supplied by their neighbours and allies in the east. What they needed now was Western-style tanks. In January, when the war had raged for almost a whole year, Kiev's persistent requests were finally answered. America, Britain and Germany all pledged Challenger tanks. Then Germany granted permission to its NATO allies to hand over their German-made Leopard tanks. It was the latest, perhaps most significant sign of support from the West for Ukraine in its war with Russia. This week on The Inquiry, we're asking, how long will international support for Ukraine last?
Part 1. Weapons from the West.
There's 2 reasons why Ukraine is winning this conflict. One is because they are fighting brilliantly and hard, and the other is Western weaponry and intelligence.
Our first expert witness is Mike Martin, Senior Fellow of War Studies at King's College in London and author of How to Fight a War. Ukraine's Western allies supply military equipment to Kiev at a rate of approximately $2 billion a month to help fight its war with Russia. But the exact nature of the weaponry that's handed over is the subject of an ongoing negotiation.
The West is not donating the military equipment in a vacuum. There is a constant conversation between the Ukrainian military and the Western donor nations. Ukraine says, here are our plans. It's a constant dialogue.
Western support for Ukraine's conflict with Russia is nothing new, but dates back to Putin's invasion of eastern Ukraine nearly a decade ago.
So if we go back to 2014, which was when Russia first intervened in Ukraine, since then, the West, predominantly the US and the UK, but also other countries to a lesser degree, have been training Ukrainians in country and supplying them with certain weapons.
The pattern of the West providing military support had therefore been long established by the time Russia's President Putin launched his full invasion of Ukraine in February of last year. But at that time, almost a year ago, as many countries in the West prepared to ramp up their military support to Ukraine, many believed it would be short-lived because Kiev would likely suffer a swift defeat.
Initially, everyone assumes that Russia would roll over the Ukrainian army. You know, it would take a week and they would be in control of the country. And I think the US and the UK took the opposite assumption, was that Ukraine actually could win this provided they had the weapons.
This has put both Britain and America at the forefront of Allied efforts to support Ukraine in its defence against Russia's invasion. Which type of military armaments they provided has changed as the conflict has progressed. Russia's first attempt at seizing Ukraine involved sending a convoy towards Kiev with the aim of taking the capital. But within days, muddy conditions caused its progress to stall, and this left Russian troops dangerously exposed to Ukrainian fire. And in order to stage these attacks, Ukrainian forces needed a particular type of artillery.
you need specific weapons that are able to pierce the armor and then destroy the vehicles. And these are called anti-tank weapons or anti-armor weapons. And the most sophisticated ones of those are the ones that are able to lock onto the heat signature of the vehicle they're trying to destroy and fly through the air and then locked on and then destroy the vehicle. And there's a particular type called Javelin, which the US and the UK use within their armed forces.
Washington and Britain together supplied over 5,000 Javelin missiles that enabled the Ukrainians to decimate the Russian armoured columns. But even at this stage, it was clear that Kiev was not going to get everything it wanted from the West. Russia then shifted its focus to seizing large swathes of Ukraine's land to the east and south. Again, Kiev's allies stepped in by sending missile systems to allow Ukraine's forces to hit targets behind enemy lines and degrade Russian military capabilities, although the Ukrainian military had pushed for more.
It wants much longer range artillery systems, the HIMARS rockets that go out to 300 kilometers. But the Western nations have decided that that would be escalatory. They don't want to give Ukraine weapons systems that enable them to attack deep within Russia. So they've turned that request down.
On New Year's Day, Ukrainian forces fired shorter-range HIMARS rockets at a Russian barracks and ammunitions dump across enemy lines in eastern Ukraine, causing significant casualties. But if Ukraine is now to reclaim the some sixth of its country which is occupied by Russian forces, it needs more and better armoured vehicles. For months, Western allies have hesitated, citing concerns that they were not strictly defensive weaponry. But then, in January, there was a change of heart.
The West has started donating tanks and infantry fighting vehicles. And these are weapons that you go on the offensive with because they enable you to cover lots of ground very quickly and to protect your troops as they punch through the front lines of your enemy.
How and where Ukraine decides to use these vehicles will define the next phase of Ukraine's war. But Mike says the decision may well be guided by another important, if less tangible, role that has been played by the West since the start: the supply of intelligence.
If you look on flight radar, actually, you'll see lots of planes that fly figure-of-8 patterns around the border of Ukraine. And what they are is NATO electronic surveillance planes. And that's just one example. But there's lots of forms of Western, particularly, again, US and UK, which are particularly strong countries for intelligence. There's lots of intelligence being gathered on the Russian forces and being given to the Ukrainians, which enables them to successfully target the high-value Russian assets.
But can Ukraine continue to rely on the West to supply arms? The country that has played by far the most important role here is America. Time for our second expert witness.
Part 2. The world's greatest military power.
To date, the United States has committed more than $25 billion in security assistance to Ukraine since the beginning of the war. Our second expert witness is Carissa Nietzsche with the Center for New American Security. She explains that the money that America has provided to Ukraine dwarfs that of past conflicts.
Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the United States has provided more support to Ukraine since then than it sent in 2020 to Afghanistan, Israel, and Egypt combined. So support to Ukraine has surpassed 3 of the largest recipients of U.S. military aid in history.
But in recent months, cracks have begun to emerge. A year ago, Ukraine enjoyed solid bipartisan support in Congress. Now, a number of representatives, most notably from Republicans on the far right, are starting to push back along 3 important lines.
The first is that it's very tough to draw a straight line between aid packages and a political or military end state. So after Afghanistan, we have a lot of members of Congress asking if we're signing the United States up for another forever war. Another rationale is about trade-offs. So for every dollar spent on Ukraine, where is it not being spent for the American people domestically. The third main argument that you hear is about the prioritization of the United States as foreign adversaries. So as we focus on Ukraine, how is that distracting the United States from our strategy in the Indo-Pacific?
By Indo-Pacific threats, Carissa is, of course, talking about China. President Biden has pledged to intervene if Beijing launches an unprovoked attack on Taiwan, and it's been widely speculated that America's show of strength in Ukraine is in part intended to show Beijing that it means business.
I think that, the United States would identify one of Beijing's ambitions or goals as creating an enhanced sphere of influence in the Indo-Pacific to become the world's leading power. And I think that, this is another area that really ties to the United States' support of Ukraine in this conflict, is that we really are trying to send a message to other authoritarian governments, China included, that the United States does not stand for the chipping away of territorial integrity of nations.
But in recent months, America's resources have been depleted by supplying military aid to Ukraine. And the question now is, does the US still have the firepower to take on the world's biggest army?
One area where we've seen a lot of shortages is in ammunition. Ukraine is firing 2 to 3 days of ammunition. That's what the United States produces in 1 month of artillery. So there are a number of Department of Defense officials who are making this calculation to ensure that military equipment provided to Ukraine does not harm the United States' ability to project power in other theaters, including the Indo-Pacific.
Polls suggest these concerns are increasingly reflected amongst the American public and could start to become a key issue in the run-up to presidential elections in 2024. What might tip the balance such that America reduces or starts to somehow rationalize its support for Ukraine?
I think the big, of course, elephant in the room, the overarching looming question is, what happens if we see a Trump 2.0 or a Trump-like figure elected? Now, this is where I think it could really jeopardize support for Ukraine. Europe is certainly very concerned about this, as is Ukraine. And this is one reason that I think Ukraine is looking to make a counteroffensive very soon. There's a lot of pressure to try to end the war in 2023 before the US elections start.
America is by no means Ukraine's only Western ally eager for a swift resolution to the Ukraine conflict. Like their American counterparts, European households are struggling with much higher living costs, in part as a direct result of the war. Not only that, in the case of Ukraine's neighbours, they also face the challenge of finding homes for the millions of Ukrainians who fled the fighting.
Part 3. European allies.
At the beginning of the war, most European countries had not really given much military support to Ukraine. And most European countries were weighing up their options, saying, well, what's the point of giving weapons to Ukraine if Ukraine is going to lose this war anyway? It's a complete waste. So as Ukraine began to demonstrate an ability to defend itself, as Ukraine began to add up all the military victories, Western countries realized that giving weapons to Ukraine was not just a lost cause. It might actually help Ukraine stop the Russian advance, and with a long-term aim of improving European security.
Our third expert witness is Samantha de Benden, an Associate Fellow at Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs. Samantha explains that at the start of the Ukraine war, European countries had differing views on how they should respond. The countries most unreservedly committed to supporting Kiev were the Baltic republics and Poland. All of them NATO countries. They immediately started to hand over their NATO weapons.
They understood what the threat was. They felt that the threat to Ukraine was a direct existential threat to them. And so you have a country like Estonia, for instance, which has given 100% of its anti-tank Javelin weapons to Ukraine, not out of love of Ukraine, because what the Estonians say is Ukraine is fighting Russia so that we don't have to fight Russia on our soil. The Poles have also been extremely generous in terms of weapons. They've given lots of their former Soviet-type T-72 tanks to Ukraine.
But further west in Europe, France was more circumspect.
Although they totally condemned the Russian invasion, there was a clear sense that we mustn't provoke escalation of this war. There was a feeling that giving weapons to Ukraine would provoke escalation. There was not the same sense of direct existential threat.
Meanwhile, Europe's largest power, Germany, was held back by its strong ties to Russia and its own historical reasons.
The Germans have had this aversion to getting involved in any sort of armed conflict in Europe since the end of the Second World War. The fact that the Germans have been providing weapons at all is an enormous change from the kind of position the German government would have had just a year ago. And early January, the German foreign minister was in eastern Ukraine in the city of Kharkiv and said, Germany will provide Ukraine with all the weapons it needs.
The UK has provided more military aid than any other nation except the United States, over $2.5 billion last year, with a commitment for the same amount in 2023. Most significantly, it has been at the forefront of efforts to supply Ukraine with cutting-edge weaponry.
The United Kingdom and Poland said we are going to give modern tanks, modern Western-built tanks to Ukraine. So there has been a very clear escalation of the type of weapons that's gone to Ukraine. And this has come hand in hand with an intensification of fighting.
The support from Europe, though far smaller than that has been offered by America, has been pivotal in helping Ukraine achieve greater success on the battlefield. But how much of it depends on the continued commitment from across the Atlantic?
If the Americans stop supporting, I think that Poland and the Baltic republics, the Czech Republic, will continue giving whatever they have, even if the Americans withdraw their support. I think in terms of the French and Germans, they might step back and have a think. I think the UK will continue supporting Ukraine, but maybe not as much as it has been.
If support were withdrawn, how would Putin move to capitalise upon that, do you think?
Well, if the West stops giving weapons to Ukraine, Ukraine's not going to be able to continue resisting Russia for very long. And we could easily see another dash for Kiev, which would probably result in the fall of the capital and it coming under Russian control.
This, of course, is exactly what Ukrainians fear most. So it's not just the country's military and politicians, but also its ordinary people who've been calling out to the West to increase its military support.
Part 4. Weapons, not words.
Our final expert witness is Simon Schlegel. Simon is from Crisis Group, an independent organisation whose stated mission is to prevent wars and shape policies that will build a more peaceful world. Simon lives and works in Ukraine and witnesses firsthand the enthusiasm with which Ukrainian people respond to the pledges of weapons from the country's Western allies.
People dressing up in leopard skin clothing, photographing themselves and spreading that online to show how enthusiastic they are about the maybe soon arrival of those tanks.
From wearing animal print clothes to campaign for the supply of German-made Leopard tanks, to posting videos online which show the Ukrainian military attacking Russian forces with American missiles.
When in summer the US delivered HIMARS systems, a long-range artillery system, arrived, the number of spectacular explosions of Russian ammunition dumps behind the enemy lines increased. And for a couple of weeks, you had these spectacular explosions filmed on your social media feeds every day. So that was really a turning point in the war that was quite visible for the population throughout Ukraine.
Simon says that Ukrainians see the commitment of the West to offering not just words but weapons as something which is deeply personally felt.
Just verbal support is not something that's enough here. We cannot survive on shoulder clapping alone. We need heavy weapons to defend ourselves, so we can only keep the state alive and this government alive if we have to choose to defend it. So I think people have quite a strong sense of distinguishing between symbolic gestures and tangible support.
What Ukrainian families also need very urgently is humanitarian aid. Here, America has again led the way and has so far given some $10 billion of support. Multiple other countries have also given large sums.
Actually, cash is still very important for most people because housing is such a big problem. Housing prices have gone up so badly, and the utility prices as well. So many of the people who've been displaced before and now live in precarious conditions, they really just need money to stay safe and to adapt by buying fuel, by buying firewood, briquettes and coal. So wherever there is a market for these things, and in most parts of Ukraine there is still a functioning market, cash is actually the best thing, and people have been asking for that, and international organizations have in many cases developed systems of direct cash payments for people to stay warm.
This brings us to the question of how long the Ukrainians have the morale and strength to endure this conflict. The answer, of course, lies largely in whether Ukrainians are confident that their president can continue to command the support of his allies in supplying him with the resources he needs to keep fighting.
Is there any concern at all within Ukraine that President Zelensky could overplay his hand with the West?
I think the opposite is much rather true, that there's a fear that Zelensky could not be asking enough and that he could be too soft on the Russians as well. He ran his campaign on a peace platform. This is always a reputation that has stayed with him a little bit. He's very popular now, but I think if he would make concessions to Russia, this popularity would vanish quite soon. So I think his approach to ask as much as possible from the West is something that makes him very popular, and so far I haven't heard any voices that tell him to go easy.
Now back to our question. How long will international support for Ukraine last? Western allies have been heavily committed to supplying weapons to Ukraine, both post-Soviet military equipment from Eastern Europe alongside more modern NATO armaments. But now countries in Western Europe and their American counterparts are starting to balance their desire to push back against Russian aggression with other looming priorities. Both the cost of living and fears of Chinese aggression are at the top of that list. But there's also another very practical concern. Our third expert witness, Samantha de Benden, points out that the conflict could drag on for some time. And the real question is not if its allies have the will, but whether Ukraine has the boots on the ground to keep going.
The biggest risk is how long can the Ukrainian army last? I mean, the Ukrainian army does not have as big a reserve to draw on as the Russian armies. How many deaths, how many more bloody battles like the ones that are taking place in the east can Ukraine sustain? So it's all very well delivering lots of weapons, but you need people to actually use those weapons. And what happens when Ukraine runs out of men?
This inquiry was presented by me, Tanya Beckett, produced by Paul Connolly, edited by Tara McDermott, and mixed by Nikki Edwards.
From the BBC World Service and CBC Podcasts,
the longest part of a scam is really the grooming process.
I keep thinking so much about you. I miss you so badly.
She was trying to get me to send her money.
Initially it was for a broken phone, fixing something in a car.
Love, Janessa, the true crime podcast exploring how one woman's stolen images are being used by criminals as bait to target people looking for love online.
She has to be one of the most catfished images.
Really, anyone can fall for this, right? There's no one type of victim.
I think he sent her close to $5,000.
Oh my gosh!
She said, if you really loved me, you'd do what I asked you to do.
And then you responded.
You used a fake identity, a false story, and stolen photographs. Why should I give you anything at all?
Join Hannah Ajala as she goes in search of the woman whose face has unwittingly launched countless romance scams. It's a story about love, deceit, and survival, and it's available now. Search for Love, Janessa wherever you found this podcast.